All right, let's get right into it. Think about the 18th century. The whole idea of monarchy was starting to feel a bit old-fashioned. It desperately needed a refresh, a rebrand for a new age of reason. And that's exactly what we're talking about today, enlightened absolutism. This wasn't about getting rid of kings and queens, not at all. It was about giving them a totally new job description.
So this is the classic model, right? Louis XIV of France, the famous Sun King, he just nailed it with this quote. He wasn't just the boss of the state, he literally was the state. His power, it came straight from God. That's divine right for you. It was absolute, you couldn't question it, and everything, and I mean everything, revolved around him.
And then, maybe a century later, you get this, a completely different take from Frederick the Great of Prussia. Now, make no mistake, he's still an absolute ruler, but look at how he justifies his power. He's not the state, he's its #1 employee, its first servant. I mean, that one little phrase shows you just how much the thinking had changed. It's a seismic shift.
So, how in the world did we get from I am the state to I serve the state? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break it all down. We'll start with that new slogan, then we'll meet the star rulers who are pushing it. After that, we'll look at their reforms and, the fine print. We'll even put their tolerance to the test with a specific case, and finally, we'll see how this whole thing created a much more competitive Europe.
First up, the state's new slogan. You see, the Enlightenment wasn't just for philosophers arguing in coffee shops. For the kings and queens of Europe, it was this incredibly practical toolkit, a new set of ideas they could use to modernize their countries, make them run better, and, let's be honest, make them way more powerful.
So what exactly is enlightened absolutism? It's basically this hybrid model. You keep the absolutism part. The monarch still has the final word on everything. But you mix in these enlightened ideas, like reason, progress, and being a bit more humane. The end goal here wasn't democracy, not even close. It was about creating a smarter, leaner, meaner form of monarchy.
And they had a pretty clear to-do list. These rulers wanted to take their tangled mess of ancient laws and make them logical. They wanted to get rid of barbaric stuff like torture. They wanted to streamline their governments to cut down on waste and corruption. And they even talked about extending religious toleration. And why? Well, it's pretty simple. A happier, more productive, and more efficient population makes for a much stronger state.
Okay, now let's meet the main characters in this story. The three rulers, who basically became the poster children for this entire movement. Each one had their own flavor, their own style, but they were all trying to walk this tightrope between the old world of absolute power and the new ideas of the Enlightenment.
Over in Prussia, you've got Frederick II, the guy who called himself the first servant. Then in Russia, we have Catherine II, who was a huge fan of the French philosophers and really worked to bring Western ideas to her empire. And finally, in Austria, there was Joseph II, probably the most ambitious and radical of them all. He really tried to tear down the old system and rebuild it from scratch.
But, and this is a huge but, here's where the story gets really interesting. It turns out pretty much every one of these so-called enlightened reforms came with some serious fine print. This is where we get to the core conflict. What happens when your progressive ideas start to threaten your own absolute power?
Just look at the massive gap here. On one side, you have all these shiny promises, reforming serfdom, making everyone equal before the law, freedom of the press. Sounds great, right? But then you look at what actually happened. When push came to shove, these rulers almost always backed the powerful nobles, kept the old social structure intact, and cracked down with censorship when they needed to. Job number one was always protecting their own power.
And there is no better example of this than the Pugachev Rebellion in Russia. So you've got Catherine the Great, the Westernizer, writing letters to Voltaire and talking a big game about legal reforms, and then bam, a massive, incredibly violent uprising of serfs, led by this guy, Emilian Pugachev, just explodes across the country. It was a direct threat to her throne and her entire government.
And the result of that rebellion was a total game changer. After brutally putting it down, all of Catherine's enlightened talk just seemed to, well, evaporate. She didn't just scrap her plans to help the serfs, she did the exact opposite. She gave the nobles even more power over their serfs. It was a cold, pragmatic move to make sure they stayed loyal and the country stayed stable. In the end, stability crushed reform.
All right, let's run another test, this time on a different Enlightenment ideal, religious toleration. A great way to see how this played out is to look at how these rulers treated their Jewish subjects. At the time, there was a movement called the Jewish Enlightenment, or the Haskalah, which was arguing that intolerance just didn't make sense in a modern world. So, how did our big three do on this test?
Oh, this table says it all, doesn't it? The results were all over the place. Joseph II in Austria, he was easily the most forward-thinking, opening up things like military service and university education to Jews. Frederick in Prussia was okay. He granted a lot of freedom, but still made it pretty clear he preferred Protestants in government. But then look at Catherine in Russia. After getting a huge Jewish population from her takeover of parts of Poland, she actually became more restrictive, forcing them to live in a specific area called the Pale of Settlement. So much for universal tolerance, huh? Their Enlightenment was very selective.
So if these reforms weren't really about making life better and more equal for everyone, then what was the real goal? Well, the answer is all about geopolitics. All those internal changes, the efficient government, the modern laws, they were all designed for one big purpose: to create stronger, tougher, more competitive countries that could dominate the European stage.
And you can see this whole power shift play out right here on this timeline. It really kicks off with the weakening of the old powerhouse in Central Europe, the Holy Roman Empire. That creates a power vacuum, which allows a newly efficient and modernized Prussia to rise up and become a major player. And it all culminates in the ultimate expression of this new power game, our three enlightened monarchies, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, ganging up to literally carve up their weaker neighbor, Poland, and divide it amongst themselves.
Yeah, the partition of Poland wasn't some random event. It was the logical conclusion of this entire system. It was the ultimate payoff. It proved how these modernized, rational states could use all that newfound efficiency not for progress, but for cold, calculated, brutal expansion. It was power politics, just with a new, more reasonable-sounding instruction manual.
So let's just boil this all down. What are the key things to remember? First, the whole justification for monarchy got a makeover. It was rebranded from a right given by God to a job serving the state. Second, those enlightened reforms were usually just practical tools to make the state stronger and more powerful. And finally, the result of all this was a new, more ruthless Europe, one defined by these super competitive states that were literally redrawing the map.
And that leaves us with one final, big question to chew on. If you just slap the word enlightened on the front of absolutism, does it really change what it is at its core? Or is it just a slicker, more efficient, better marketed version of total control? Something to think about.